Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Welcome to tonight's MACRI Talk, Suffrage from a Southwest View. Tonight is the eve of Women's Equality Day, which commemorates August 26, 1920, when the 19th Amendment was certified as part of our Constitution, assuring that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. I would like to welcome Dr. Cathleen Cahill, author of Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement, who will lead us on a journey tonight to learn about the history and legacy of Nina Otero-Warren, a women's suffragist, educator, and politician from New Mexico. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be here with you all tonight. And thank you, Sarah, for inviting me. And yes, I will be in San Antonio in October, but I'm happy to be joining you on Zoom today. So I am going to be talking a lot about New Mexico this evening, not Texas so much, but I hope you'll enjoy it. So I want to start, and if we could pull the slides up, Sarah's going to help me with that today because I couldn't get them to work on my computer. So this first image, which I love, is a mural from downtown Albuquerque, and I just wanted to point out that Nina Otero-Warren's story is quite well known in New Mexico, but for a long time it wasn't really well known outside of that state, and it's becoming more and more well known. And the new quarter that we'll see some pictures of is really part of the way in which her story and the story of the Hispanas in New Mexico who fought for suffrage is becoming a much more widely known story. So I want to start in Santa Fe by setting a scene. So the next slide, please. This will be a picture of the Santa Fe Plaza, that one, around 1920. You can see the white building there is the Palace of Governors. The Palace of the Governors was sort of the seat of power. It was first the Spanish capital, and then the Mexican capital, and then finally the American capital. And so the plaza there is a very important political site. So in Santa Fe in October of 1915, about 150 women assembled there on that plaza near the Palace of the Governors for a suffrage parade. And the women were Anglo women as well as Hispanic women. And they used the term Hispana in New Mexico, and I'll talk a little bit about why they use that specifically. Some of them rode in automobiles that were decorated, like this next slide. Mrs. Trinidad Cabeza de Vaca, whose family owned one of the first cars in Santa Fe, in the next slide, lent hers to the cause. And this is from a parade the next year, but I think that that's Nina Otero-Warren in the front seat, not in the striped shirt, but in the black jacket. So again, a number of other Hispanas marched that day. Most of the women there, those women were bilingual, and they had very prominent political connections through their family members. So their husbands, their fathers, their brothers were all politically powerful men. One of the other women that I want to call attention to was a woman named Dolores, or Lola Armijo, who was in fact the state librarian of New Mexico and the first woman to serve in the state government. She had been appointed, not elected, in 1912. So this group of women, hundreds of people in town, turn out to watch them march in support of the right of women to vote. And the marchers go from the Palace of the Governors, and they trace kind of a figure eight through town. They go out around from the plaza out to the new state capitol. They go around it, back to the plaza, and then out to the federal courthouse, which was on the other side of town. So they're really kind of claiming those political spaces. So when we think about suffrage parades, and if you see pictures in documentaries, they usually don't take place in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and they usually don't include Spanish-speaking or Hispana women or Latina women even. But I would argue that the participation of these women and their stories really make a difference in our histories, and we need to understand their participation in the fight for the right to vote. Most, again, of these stories and photos and images that we see come from back east and are often sort of the main national leaders like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who are white women from eastern states. So what I'm going to do today is refocus our lens on the Southwest, and especially particularly New Mexico. And New Mexico is really pretty unique, but without the women in New Mexico, the fight for women's suffrage and the 19th Amendment might not have succeeded, right? They play a really key role. So today or tomorrow on Women's Equality Day, we will talk about Nina Otero-Warren, who's being celebrated and honored with the quarter, but I'll also use her story to tell the story of the fight for the 19th Amendment, and you'll see how connected, right, and inseparable those two stories are. You'll also hear as I go along some of the names and parts of the stories of other Hispanas, as well as Hispanos who supported this fight, both politically as politicians and also as voters, which is actually really important. We don't usually think about them. So I would argue, and I think you'll agree, that our histories of the fight for women's suffrage and women's political representation should always include the story of Latinas, because without them, those histories are absolutely incomplete. So I'm going to start with some big context, sort of, again, setting the scene of what was happening politically. And I'm going to start in 1910, which was 2 years before New Mexico became a state. And again, in New Mexico is often called a triracial state, right, with Nuevo Mexicanos, Anglos, and Native Americans, as well as a smaller number of other people. But I'm really talking about Anglos and Hispanos today for a really incredible history of Native people in New Mexico and the right to vote. I've recommended a book that I'll have at the end by Maurice Crandall. So in 1910, New Mexicans were in the middle of their bid for statehood. So if we could go to the next slide, we'll see a picture of a graph of the census to just give you a sense of the numbers. You can see that the majority of people in New Mexico were Hispanic, right? Which generally meant that they were descended from the people who had become US citizens under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. That treaty, of course, doesn't include Native Americans who had been considered Mexican citizens, but does give U.S. citizenship to any former Mexican citizen who wanted to take it up. So that was in the late 1840s. By the 1880s, railroads had arrived in New Mexico, and the number of Anglos was growing. But Spanish speakers still maintained a large population and therefore political power in New Mexico. And so you see this, a scholar named Rosino Lozano has shown how in those former Mexican territories, in all of them briefly, but in New Mexico much longer, the state legislature or the territorial legislature was bilingual. The laws were printed in Spanish and English. The proceedings were printed in Spanish and English. And this was because of that political power. And in New Mexico, it's maintained for much longer than, say, a place like California or Colorado. So New Mexico, Spanish speakers are powerful, but the rest of the country has its reservations about that. And they thought that the populations of Arizona and New Mexico were too foreign, too Catholic, and using the wrong language. So in 1910, Congress stipulated that the new New Mexico Constitution should include an English-only provision, and that office holders had to be proficient in English, and school instruction would only be in English. So that's kind of the political context. Let me give you a brief bit of suffrage context. So in the next slide, suffrage activists had been fighting not for a constitutional amendment at this point, but on a state-by-state basis. So they were trying to make the changes to state constitutions or state legislation, because states have the power to determine how voting is structured, right? Who gets to vote, who doesn't, where voting takes place. These sorts of decisions were, particularly at that time, left to the states. So you can see in this map, the white states are states, and this is by 1914, but the white states, mostly in the West, were states where women had won full suffrage rights in, again, much of the American West, not New Mexico, you see there, and not Texas. So as New Mexicans got together to create this new constitution, suffrage, the question of language, the question of religion, were all things that were very important. And Spanish-speaking women played an important role in those debates. So one of those women participating in those debates was Nina Otero-Warren. Her full name was Maria Adelina Isabella Amelia Luna Otero, or Nina to her friends. And she was born in 1881 in her family's hacienda in Los Lunas, which was just south of Albuquerque, very close. She was from, again, a prominent political family that traced their roots back to the Spanish conquest of New Mexico. And they had, again, maintained this powerful political presence. Her uncle, Miguel Otero, had been appointed to the territorial governor by President McKinley. And her maternal uncle, Solomon Luna, was one of the major leaders during the Constitutional Convention. But despite that political power, her family was still affected by the violence of the US conquest of the Southwest. So to give you a sense of this, when she was very young, about 2 years old, her father was shot and killed by an Anglo squatter who was trying to claim a portion of their land. So her mother remarries and has 9 more children. She had 3, Nina and 2 boys, and then 9 more children. Nina's very close with all of them. They were a very close family. She was fairly well educated for a girl at this time. She went to school in Albuquerque to St. Vincent's Academy until she was 11. And then she moved to St. Louis, Missouri for 2 years, where she attended Marysville College of the Sacred Heart, which is now Marysville University of St. Louis. So she was there by herself for 2 years. And this helped her, right, really practice her English, to train, and she comes home fairly well educated and bilingual. When she was 16, her stepfather got a political position in Santa Fe. So the family moves to the state capital in Santa Fe. And this is the center of both social life and politics, and she loves it. She really thrives there. A number of years later, she was 16 when they moved. 10 years later, when she's 26, this is 1908, she meets and marries a man serving in the U.S. cavalry. He's an officer in the cavalry named Rawson Warren. And this, when she marries, she takes the name Nina Otero-Warren. And he's, as I said, a cavalry officer. He's stationed out at Fort Wingate near the Navajo Reservation on the far side of the state. And things really just don't go well. She doesn't like being an officer's wife. She doesn't like that military life. It's very isolated. There are very few women at the post. She misses her family. And it's sort of unclear what else happens, but they divorce after 2 years and she moves back to Santa Fe. Because at the time being divorced was actually pretty stigmatized, right? And people would have talked about her. She kept his name, and she often called herself a widow, right? So not everybody knew that she was actually divorced. So because she was going through that in 1910, she wasn't really around during the state constitutional convention. But again, many of her family members were involved, and she must have heard and been part of kind of the debates in her family. But another Nueva Mexicana, a woman named Aurora Lucero, in the next slide, please, was there and played a key role, in the convention. Sorry, let me talk about this really fast. This is just an example of how people outside of New Mexico thought about the state. You can see they think about New Mexico and Arizona as sort of children, childlike, maybe not ready to be states. And the other one, the implication is she needs to change her dress, right, from a Spanish or Mexican looking dress into what Americans would have seen as a modern, more civilized dress, right? Next slide, please. So Nina is on the right, Aurora Lucero is on the left, and she at the time was a young college student at the New Mexico Normal School in Las Vegas, New Mexico. And she participates in these debates. So Congress had said it had to be an English-only constitution. Well, when she goes to give a speech at the territorial speech contest, so it's the whole of New Mexico, these students are giving speeches. Her speech is, which wins, is, shall the Spanish language be taught in the schools of New Mexico? Or, and if we could see the next slide, as the Spanish language papers reported it, defensa de nuestro idioma, right? So defense of our language. And this was a direct response to Congress, who wants to make the state English only. And it's a really powerful argument for why Spanish is useful, why it can contribute to the nation, and why New Mexicans should maintain Spanish. She talks a lot about the Spanish heritage, right? A European heritage. It's very Eurocentric, right? So she's not thinking about this. She's really centering the Spanish European nature of the language. And she talks about like Cervantes and the deep literary tradition in Spanish. She also talks about the heritage of her ancestors, right? The conquistadors who conquered New Mexico, and that they're comparable to, say, the Pilgrims in Eastern United States. And then she makes a very contemporary argument that Spanish language and bilingual citizens will help the United States in its foreign policy, right? This is a time when the US has expanded and the territories of the Philippines and Puerto Rico, right, have come into the nation, where the US is looking to Latin America. And she says, New Mexico has a lot to offer. So this speech is reprinted across New Mexico and even into El Paso. And historians really credit her with helping to encourage the Constitutional Convention to really push against that English-only language. So the men who were there at the Constitutional Conventions listen. And can we see the next slide, please? And in the Constitution, they put in very strong protections for the Spanish language rights, as well as freedom of religion. And this is meant to really protect Catholicism, which was what many of the people in New Mexico practiced, which was seen as, again, not necessarily a good thing by many Anglos in the US. So you can see that this language also then protects the right to vote very strongly, right? That religion, race, language, or color, or illiteracy in both English and Spanish are not reasons that people can be kept from voting. This is very strong. They do say that the right to vote can be abridged based on exceptions that are provided in the Constitution. So if we read further down in the Constitution, here are what those exceptions are. In particular, it says Indians not taxed. That's almost all Native people in the state. So they're disenfranchised. Women are only allowed to vote in school-related elections, and those are held separately. So it's like school boards and superintendents of schools. And they can run for those offices and they can vote in those elections, but those are separate from any other elections. And then there's some limitations on, right, residency, how long you have to live in the state and in the county in order to vote. But again, the sort of way in which they protect people from things like race or language, when at the time, right, we have to remember that this is the period of Jim Crow, where in the American South, race is being used to keep African Americans from voting, right? So New Mexicans know what's going on, and they write this in very strictly. You can also see that they make it then very, very hard to change the state constitution to sort of keep these protections. To change the constitution or to change any part of it that has to do with voting, you need 3/4 of everybody in the whole state to vote. And in each county, 2/3 of everybody of all voters have to vote to change the amendment, right? So this is actually a very high bar, and it's almost impossible to change these stipulations on voting. So if you think about the women who are pushing for women's suffrage, it's going to be really hard to get anything more at the state level than those school elections, right? It's almost impossible to change this. And women had been there pushing for full suffrage. The New Mexico Federation of Women's Clubs had been lobbying, and again, this includes both Anglo and Hispanic women, especially in Santa Fe. But even there, they couldn't get full suffrage, only this partial suffrage of school elections. So the right to vote for Spanish-speaking men, very protected. Women get a little bit, but then the Constitution is going to be almost impossible to change. So if we remember the strategy that suffragists were using nationwide, it was to try to change at the state level. That means New Mexico's sort of stuck. And that's going to then affect how suffrage will develop in the state. Luckily, just at about the same time, so New Mexico becomes a state in 1912. Congress actually approves this, even with the Spanish language stipulations. And in 1913, if we can see the next slide, a woman named Alice Paul, who was a young woman, you may have heard of her, who was a suffragist, who had been in England and been inspired by the British suffrage movement, which was much more radical, came back to the United States, threw a huge parade in Washington, D.C., and said, we really need to change our strategy. We have to push for a constitutional amendment. It's taking way too long to go state by state. There are certain states that are never going to change, and we need to shake things up. And you can see the float there that was right at the beginning of the parade making this demand, a constitutional amendment. So that gives New Mexican women a new opportunity, right? A new way to fight for the right to vote. And it really invigorates the movement in the state. Next slide, please. Supposedly every state in the Union was represented in this parade, but I haven't been able to figure out if any New Mexican women were actually there. It's likely that you can see here someone represented the state by carrying a sign with the name of the state on it. But again, we know they're going to have other parades in New Mexico. So Alice Paul forms something called the National Women's Party coming out of this parade, and the National Women's Party is going to push for a constitutional amendment. And she sends people all around to all the different states to form state associations. And when they come to New Mexico to recruit, they find New Mexican women very excited about this idea, right? Because that's the only thing they can fight for at this point. Both Nina Otero-Warren and Aurora Lucero met with those organizers and said, you cannot organize for suffrage in this state successfully unless you work with Spanish speakers, right? And they insisted that suffrage literature be printed in Spanish and English, that speeches be given in Spanish and English. Otherwise, they recognized that you would be missing a major part of New Mexican voters and it would fail. The National Women Party organizers, for the most part, are actually pretty open to this. One was not, but one of the New Mexicans wrote back to Alice Paul, quote, she was a Texas Democrat and should not have come into a Republican state. And we've got to remember that, right, parties were differently aligned at this time, and the Democratic Party was, in the South, the party of white supremacy. And again, Hispanics in New Mexico knew this, and they understood that that would be a bad thing for them generally. So they were, again, at the time, most of them were Republicans, though not all. So the National Women's Party organizers listened, and they wisely incorporated Spanish speakers into the cause. In 1915, an organizer came to town and wrote back to Alice Paul that she recognized the power of these Spanish-speaking women. She also wrote that she herself spoke a little bit of Spanish. She was from South Carolina, and she said it's, quote, very little, but it helps a lot. And working together, they wrote up speeches, they published literature, they emphasized topics that appealed to the Hispanic women, like child welfare, for example, and education. And she wrote, they say it is very difficult to get the Spanish ladies out, but as I have one on the program to speak in Spanish, I think they will come, and their husbands will as well. So it was for that visit and that organizing that they held the parade in Santa Fe that I opened with. So next slide, please. So they marched through the city in that figure 8, remember? And they actually end the parade at the house of U.S. Senator Thomas Catron, one of the New Mexico senators. He was a Republican, but he was a notorious anti-suffragist. But nonetheless, there were 4 women designated, 2 women to give a speech in English and 2 women to give speeches in Spanish. And they asked him to formally support the federal amendment when he goes back to Washington, D.C. He sort of greets them politely and he listens to their speeches, but then he begins to explain to them why suffrage is a bad thing for women. We might think of this contemporarily as mansplaining, but he gives them a whole set of reasons that he thinks women shouldn't be voting. He said women and men are very different. These are very familiar anti-suffrage arguments. They're too different, and women shouldn't be involved in politics. It desexes women. It makes them too much like men and not feminine. He points to the work of anti-suffrage women, and there were women who were against the right to vote, and said, look, women don't really want the right to vote, so why are you pushing for it? And significantly, and I just want to point this out, he raises the point that his congressional colleagues from the South were concerned about. And this next slide has some difficult language on it, but I want to show it. I think it's important. Oh, actually, the next slide is a picture of them with the senator. You see him there at his house. He's a little overwhelmed. The next slide, though, has the language. So again, this was from this is in 1915 that this parade happens. And here's a card from Georgia from 1916 that explicitly says that people were against the right to vote because they were worried that Black women would be able to vote, right? And they were worried that raising the issue of voting as a constitutional amendment would remind the nation that the 15th Amendment existed and was basically being ignored during the Jim Crow period. It was very anti-suffrage throughout the South. So the National Women's Party organizer basically tells Senator Catron that this wasn't going to be an issue because the national organization had accepted a states' rights position where all the states could do whatever they wanted to do in terms of deciding which women would vote. And she explicitly says, and in the South, you can see that Jim Crow laws keep Black men from voting. They'll also keep Black women from voting. And this is generally the stance of those mainstream suffrage organizations. But it probably wasn't reassuring to Black women who lived in New Mexico. And again, the Hispanic women are also aware of kind of racial politics and concerned because as Spanish speakers, they've experienced some prejudice, right? That people didn't want them to be a state because of that. In 1917, they organize, they adopt a constitution for this National Women's Party in New Mexico. They elect officers, and the first president is a woman, an Anglo woman from Albuquerque, but she steps down very soon afterwards. And Nina Otero-Warren had been elected vice president, and she moves into the president's position. So she is in charge of suffrage in New Mexico. And she writes to Alice Paul saying, "I am with you now and always." She is also incredibly busy with her own work. Can we see the next slide, please? She is the New Mexico Board of Education had appointed her interim superintendent of schools in Santa Fe. And the next year, she actually runs for that position. It's one of those very few elected positions women can run for. She wins, she defeats a man, and this sort of demonstrates that she can run a campaign. That's going to come in handy later. That same year, the Democrats elect, New Mexico elects Democratic Senator A.A. Jones. And he actually, when he gets to the Senate, they all get their sort of committees, right? The committee work gets handed out. And he's given the chair of the Women's Suffrage Committee in the US Senate. 1917, right, is right as World War I is starting, the Great War. And the suffragists are really making a big push for suffrage. But the suffrage amendment isn't going anywhere in Congress until he, as chair of the committee, says it can go to the floor for a vote. So he plays a really important role in the suffrage fight that we don't always think about. Just to give you an example of how important Spanish language was in New Mexico politics, every politician that couldn't speak Spanish had an interpreter, and interpreters played a really important role on the campaign trail, giving the speeches. And if you had a good interpreter, that could really help you. And Senator Jones recognizes that his interpreter, Dennis Chavez, was really good, and he brings him to Washington to work as clerk in the Senate while he's there. And Jones is married, and he brings his wife, Chavez is married, and he brings his wife, Imelda Espinosa Chavez, and she comes with him to DC, and they both live there. Dennis Chavez takes night classes to train as a lawyer, and Imelda Chavez works in the Treasury Department. So they're right there. They have a front row seat along with the other Congress people and congressional committee in New Mexico. So during the war, suffragists sort of split on whether or not to support Woodrow Wilson and support the war. A lot of women were active in the Peace Party, and it becomes a real contentious issue. But in New Mexico, it's not. Many of the leaders, like Nina Otero-Warren and Aurora Lucero, are very involved in war work. Nina Otero-Warren forms the New Mexico Auxiliary of the National Defense Council, and she's chairwoman of one of the districts. She's helps sort of distribute food administration cards in Spanish and English and rations. She joins the Red Cross and chairs the Red Cross for Santa Fe County. Aurora Lucero is doing like fruit drying demonstrations on the plaza to help people save food for the war. And when her brother, Antonio Jr., joined the Navy, she volunteers with the women's section of the Navy League. So both of them, along with many, many other women, are really trying to show that they can support the country, be patriotic, and continue to fight for suffrage. And Congress recognizes this. And in June of 1919, the Senate, the House had passed the amendment. The Senate passes the amendment in June, and then it goes out to the states for ratification, right? So it's a very long process. You have to get it through Congress, the language and approval, and then it has to go out to the states for ratification. And they needed 36 states to ratify the Constitution. The women in New Mexico were feeling really confident. Nina Otero-Warren was in charge of a suffrage jubilee. They celebrate, and then they get to work to try to push for the ratification. But it ends up taking a little bit longer than they anticipate. They thought, right, it comes out of Congress in June. They thought by the end of the summer they would have it. It really takes until the following February. But in the meantime, Nina Otero-Warren has stepped down from her nonpartisan suffrage position in the National Women's Party and joined the Republican Party officially, which people knew because her family was a Republican family. but she accepts the position as chair of the New Mexico Republican State Women's Committee. And they're forming these committees because they're anticipating women are going to be able to vote, and they want them to vote right for their party. So in February of 1920, the New Mexico legislature holds a special session. And again, it seemed like it was going to be pretty easy, but at the very last minute, there's sort of a bolt, and a number of people who had said they would vote for suffrage start to waver and change their mind. And Nina Otero-Warren really leads the charge of whipping them in shape, right? And getting them back to their promise to vote to ratify the amendment. So she is down on the floor. She's in their offices. And again, now she has an official position in the Republican Party. So she's really pushing the Republican legislators to support it. And without that sort of last minute pressure from her, New Mexico may not have approved and voted to ratify the 19th Amendment. So New Mexico is the 32nd state to ratify the amendment. It needed 36. It barely got the next 4. It took 6 more months until Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify in August of 1920. So I think, right, that's a really important point. Without New Mexico as the 32nd state to ratify, we might not have the 19th Amendment. And without Nina Otero-Warren and the work that she and the other suffragists in New Mexico did, it might not have been ratified in New Mexico. So, sorry, next slide, please. Where I lost myself. This is a flyer from California where there was also several Spanish-speaking women who similarly helped translate flyers and give speeches in Spanish in the California state suffrage referendum, which passed in 1911. Next slide, please. Next slide. We'll just push forward. Here she is. One more. And one more. We're going to skip that one. I can talk about that later. So August 1920, ratified. There's an election in November, right? So again, we've already seen the parties trying to incorporate women, and you see a real push. And the women's clubs are trying to teach women how to vote. And in New Mexico, they again had been voting in school elections, but in the main elections, right, maybe they might need some help. So citizenship classes, discussions about voting, and then the parties themselves really pushing to incorporate women. Next slide, please. So here's another flyer. This is a bilingual flyer from a group of women who were actually trying to be outside the party system in what was called the Fusion Party, because they were critical of both parties. And so they kind of picked men from each party to vote for. But you can see it's bilingual because that was really important in New Mexican elections. Next slide, please. Sorry, not that one. Next slide. Well, we'll pause here. So 1920, women participate, but they still can't run for any office other than school offices without the New Mexico Constitution being changed. So one of the things that both parties pledge in 1920 is that they will change the constitutional language and allow for anyone to run for office regardless of sex. That's easier to change than the portion that talks about voting. And so after that election, they make that change. So in 1922, as I said, the parties really want women to recognize, newly enfranchised women to recognize that they value them. And so they begin to incorporate women not only as campaign speakers, but also as candidates. And Nina Otero-Warren runs for Congress as a Republican in 1922. And first she has to win the primary, which she does against a sitting incumbent who was also Spanish-speaking man. And he was really frustrated that she runs against him because he had been a suffrage supporter and voted for the amendment. But she wins the primary, and so she runs for office. And you can see, this is not a great picture, I apologize, but it's a Spanish language poem from one of the Spanish language papers praising her and talking about her and why she'll make a good candidate. So she has a lot of support throughout the state, but she loses partially because it seems like her cousin, who was mad with her, was spreading rumors, they were true, but rumors that she was not in fact a widow, but she was a divorcee, and was pretty scandalous. So she loses by about 10,000 votes, but she ran. Other women, however, run in this same election and win. Next slide, please. We're going to skip through a couple, I think. This is just Democratic speakers. It's several women that they hire to campaign. Next slide. Nina's campaign makes national news, and you can see they're really spinning her as of noble Spanish descent, right? This is very kind of exotic. But she's one of just a handful of women running for Congress right after the 19th Amendment passes. So it is national news. Next slide, please. There we go. So she's running on the Republican ticket. The Democrats also nominate a woman named Soledad Chavez de Chacon, who was Dennis Chavez's cousin. And they run her as Secretary of State is the position that they run her for. So a state office. And she wins. And she becomes the first woman in the nation, Anglo, Hispanic, anything, first woman to win statewide office, and the first woman to serve as Secretary of State. So really historic. And of course, Secretary of State's an important position. Again, that's in terms of how easy access to voting is going to be in your state. That's the Secretary of State's job. So she wins that position, and they renominate her again 2 years later, and she serves for those 2 terms. Then she steps down to be with her children, but then comes back and serves in the New Mexico State Legislature later. And you can see here that another woman, Isabella Eccles, was elected that year to superintendent of schools. So to sort of wrap up here, New Mexicans have been really important firsts for Spanish language or Hispanic identifying politicians. And we see that as early as Nina Otero-Warren's run, as Soledad Chavez de Chacon's win as Secretary of State. New Mexico also had the first 2 Latina governors, and the first Republican with Suzanne Martinez, and then the first Democrat with Michelle Lujan Grisham, who's currently in office, right? And a lot of the first congressmen, Hispanic congressmen, come out of New Mexico as well. So Dennis Chavez becomes the first elected to Senate from New Mexico and serves for a very long time. Nina Otero-Warren doesn't ever run for office again. Next slide, please. But she does stay politically involved. She is appointed in the 1920s as Inspector of Indian Schools in New Mexico, which is a federal position. And then in the 1930s, like actually a lot of the Hispanic folks in New Mexico, she switches parties and becomes a Democrat under FDR and the New Deal. And towards the end of the 1930s and in the 1940s, he appoints her as superintendent of bilingual education in Puerto Rico. So, right, that argument that Aurora Lucero had made for the importance of the bilingual speakers in New Mexico, helping the US in other positions, you really see that with her career. We can also think about that as part of the creation of a larger Latino identity, right? She's from New Mexico. She thinks of herself as a Hispanic woman. It's a very different sort of history than Puerto Rico, but she's there to work with instructors in Spanish language. That Spanish language is the important connector. She and Aurora Lucero also then turned to history and cultural work, and both of them go on to write books that celebrate the Hispanic heritage in the Southwest, in New Mexico, and a number of these pieces actually end up in like children's English books, right? Literary books, the English language versions, in elementary schools across the country. And they both insisted that, right, New Mexico and the Spanish-speaking citizens of New Mexico were part of U.S. history and deserved to have that history written. And they spend a lot of the kind of second half of their lives doing that work. So I'm going to conclude with that. I went a little bit over, I apologize, but if you have any questions, I am very happy to talk about them. And actually, if we could see the last slide was the quarter, which you've seen on the flyer. So the kind of way in which the history is being recognized today. So thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. Do you think I don't know that you know very much about this, but how did this quarter come about?
Oh, I don't know that much about it, but I do know that it's part of a series that they're doing of putting women on, different women, historical women on quarters. And I think they're releasing like 5 every couple years. So I know, for example, for blanking on her name right now, the first woman to serve as chief of the Cherokee Nation, Wilma Mankiller, was on the quarter for Oklahoma. And they've had a series of these. And I think, thank you. Yeah, thanks. Oh, hello, Michelle. One of my former students from UNM. So I think that it's part of the celebration of the centennial of the 19th Amendment, which happened in 2020, but it's sort of an ongoing series of coins that they're releasing sort of periodically. Yeah. And I don't know how they chose her. I think it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting just because we think of how long it has been since, for example, Susan B. Anthony appeared on a coin. Susan B. Anthony, perhaps one of the most famous women's suffrage activists. And now 100 years after the passage of, or I guess 102 years after, 102 years after the 19th Amendment is enacted, we get a Latina, the first Latina on any American money, but she was in fact somebody who was very active in suffrage. So thank you for sharing all of that information. I think that for a lot of us who never heard of her, and so now that this quarter is out, we want to make sure people do know who she is. When you finally get your hands on one, I was hoping I would find one at the bank, but I haven't so far. But they should be circulating soon. I wanted to ask you a question about women in New Mexico and perhaps throughout the Southwest, but especially New Mexico, where they had such a large Mexican descent population for so long. But I wanted to ask you about perhaps the impact of Spanish legal tradition on their own thinking about women's rights. Because I know that, for example, under Spanish law, and this was certainly very much part of Texas history too, but under Spanish law, women could inherit land and in ways that were not as common for women under like British law that got brought to the East Coast. So I'm just wondering if that maybe influenced women's understanding of their rights in New Mexico.
I think absolutely. I don't have any documents where Nina Otero-Warren or Aurora Lucero or those women said anything specifically about that, but absolutely, right? I mean, there was definitely a recognition that as Anglos came into New Mexico, one of the huge sort of controversies was that they were using the Anglo legal system to dispossess the Hispanos of the Spanish land grants, right? And there's definitely, it's very clear, everybody understands, and there's a lot of graft and misappropriation, but it's also very clear that the Anglo legal system is different and is going to be harmful to people who had been under the Spanish and then Mexican law. And absolutely, right, women's property rights are a big part of that. And what's interesting is that those states like California or New Mexico that had been under that legal tradition continued to have sort of echoes of it across time. So, things like divorce law and just all kinds of things that are state by state differed in those states. Communal property, for example, right, where if you got divorced, your property was divided. That wasn't the case in a lot of Eastern states that were under Anglo common law. So that echoed through, and I'm sure that they were aware of it because it was such a big part of just what they were living through at the time with property being lost.
Well, it is interesting because for a lot of the people of Mexican descent living in the Southwest, the time period of the women's suffrage movement overlaps with a lot of tension between Anglos and Mexicanos, particularly around land, around belonging. So it resonates on multiple levels here, I think, this story. We do have a question that I wanted to share here. What can modern Latinas learn about organizing from Nina Otero-Warren's story?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And from what I can see, and right, I'm sure there are others who could add to this, but it's the importance of, right, not forgetting people, right? There's a very large constituency that she and the other women recognized, right, needed the Spanish language literature and speeches, and that deserved it, right? And that they were part of the politic and the polity, and they could be mobilized, and they went out and found them, but met them where they were, right? And thought about the kinds of issues that they cared about. They're traveling actually quite a bit. And when she campaigns for office, the newspapers all point out that she visited every county in the state, and she's driving a car. So she goes with her sister and some friends. So it's this car full of women. And New Mexico is really big, right? And they go to every county to campaign. And I think that sense of not taking people for granted and trying to meet them where they are. And then absolutely, right, the tools of bilingualism, she knew that was important. That doesn't become something that is required by law until 1975. So the First Amendment to the Voting Rights Act addresses this issue of language and the ability to, access voting. If you don't speak English before that, you in most places, you're just out of luck. It was a way of disenfranchising people. But the Voting Rights Act, the amendment of 1975, says, if you have a certain percentage of population, you have to provide the ballot and election information in that language.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I hope that brought a new group of people to learn about Nina Otero-Warren tonight. And I want to thank you, Cathleen, for sharing your knowledge with us, for sharing your expertise. If you're interested in learning more about women of color and suffrage, you've got a book. Do you want to tell us about it real quick? And I'll drop a link here.
I do.
Tell us about your book.
So it's called Recasting the Vote, and it's a collective biography of 6 women. Nina Otero-Warren is one of them, but it's also 3 Indigenous women, an African-American woman, and a Chinese-American woman, all of who have some things in common. They're all fighting for suffrage in this same time period, but they also are all coming at it from different perspectives, motivations, different things that their communities care about. So thank you. Yeah,
wonderful. Well, I look forward to seeing what you come up with next. This was really informative. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I want to thank our guest speaker. And I also want to thank our funders, including the City of San Antonio, Wells Fargo, AARP, and individual donors like you. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, I encourage you to learn more about MACRI by visiting our website at somosmacri.org. We regularly host events like this, and so we hope to see you again in the future. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yes, have a great night.
Yeah.